Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is called NEC Project Audits and Contractual Health Checks. My name is Lauren Flatt, and I am one of the Strategic Account Managers here at Digital Beehive, and I'll be your host for today. Before we get into today's webinar, I just want to touch on a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. So firstly, you'll notice that as you're joining, your camera will automatically be turned off and your microphone's muted, and they will remain off for the duration of the session. The chat function at the top has been disabled, but if you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A section at any time and we'll pick those up as we go through. We encourage you to ask questions as we go through, and we'll address them during the session and also towards the end at the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. So next, I would like to introduce you to our guest speakers today who bring decades of NEC experience with us. So firstly, I'd like to welcome up Neil Earnshaw, NEC expert, trainer and director of NEC Consult. We've also got Glenn Hyde, NEC expert, trainer and director of GMH Planning. And then we're also joined by Lesley Hunt from Jacobs, who specialises in procurement strategy and contract administration within complex delivery environments. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Neil, who will kick us off for today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for that, Lauren. Let's give you a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at before we dive into the content then. So firstly, we're going to look at how to health check your project across sort of key areas of the NEC contract. So we're going to first look at programme and identify what good looks like and what areas we might want to review when considering whether programme is working effectively. We'll also then do a similar thing with early warnings, with compensation events, with payment, and finally we'll finish off looking at reporting in terms of what we may do with all this data to present it once we get to the end of an audit or a health check. While we're going through the content, can you all have a think about if there are any other aspects that you think that we should be auditing that we haven't covered today? So as we go through, if you think about, oh, well, I'd be looking at this, I'd be looking at that, I don't think you've covered this in sufficient detail, then please sort of make a note of that, and we'll come back to that question at the end, see if anyone else has got any suggestions. Remember, as Lauren says, as we go through the content, if you see anything or if somebody says something that prompts a question in your mind, then that's a great time to ask the question. So post it in the Q&A function. We may come to it straight away, or we may come to it a bit later in the webinar. So without further ado, let's dive in then. So firstly, what we should all do is make sure that we periodically review our contracts for performance to make sure that they are working as effectively as possible, and if not, to take corrective action to keep things going well. You may decide on a different frequency for doing these reviews, but I'd suggest maybe looking at certainly at least every quarter or maybe every 6 months, but the frequency will depend on the size, scale, I guess, and complexity of the project or program that you're regularly working on. One key thing is make sure we get this up and running at the start of our contracts and make sure we review it throughout, okay? Now, we can do this individually for ourselves, or we could do it jointly as a team, and it's certainly a lot more powerful and effective if we do it as a team so we can all learn and improve together. But it's entirely up to yourselves to decide how you want to do that, whether you just want to make sure your own house is in order or whether the team want to look at it together. Also, we should look for areas to improve and where people may need support as well. So, we should identify any areas and then divert resource into looking at those areas in more detail to see how people can get help. We can also assess our contracts against specific criteria and produce written reports as outputs as well. But really, it's all about action. It's about learning from what's going on in our projects, and the key thing is the action bit in terms of taking corrective action where things aren't going well. Because let's face it, we all do get bogged down in the management of our contracts from time to time. That's a reality. doing a health check shouldn't be seen as some kind of remedial activity that's trying to punish people. It should be seen as an opportunity to improve and to keep our projects on track, to hopefully reduce the chances of us having disagreements and possibly even helping us to avoid disputes as well. It'd also be a good idea if we took this approach, not just between client and contractor with the project team at that level, but we should also do it throughout the supply chain to make sure we're managing our subcontractors and suppliers effectively as well.
Excellent, thanks, Phil. Yeah, I think that's the key point, isn't it? You said there, like, I like to focus on the word health check because that's a more positive thing. You know, we all need to make sure we're well, looking after ourselves. So project audit could sound a little bit sort of negative or a bit scary. Exactly the same thing as a project health check. So one thing is whatever is a more positive outcome for you or a positive connotation, then think of it as that. So health check, they're a healthy thing. They're worthy, and they're going to be beneficial for your project health. So yeah, positive experience is the key thing we should see these as being. So a big topic, one that's very close to my heart, is program. And NEC sets out to try and make sure that programs were elevated in terms of their level of importance. And it does it in a number of ways within the contract. So these are just some of the sort of core principles that NEC is trying to instill when it comes to program. I'm sure you're all familiar with clause 31.2, our big list of items that needs to be shown on the contractor's program. So it's a big bullet point list. So all of those need to be included. We've then got clause 32.1, which is a revised programs, what also needs to be included on a revised program. In contract data, part 1, we'll find the frequency that the client is requiring the programs to be submitted within, and generally that is going to be fortweekly or monthly. So occasionally it can be something maybe shorter, but typically fortweekly or monthly will be the requirement to regularly submit that revised program. So it's not just once, this will be throughout the life of the project, they should be submitted. All of these programs then are issued to the project manager and they have to be formally accepted or not accepted. And then clause 31.3 gives the reasons why a program can be not accepted. Otherwise, the default obviously is if there's no reason not to accept it, then it should be accepted. So the criteria are listed there in 31.3. And the accepted program definition is a defined term, and it confirms that once the program is accepted, it makes it very clear it supersedes the previous accepted program. So once a program is accepted, that is the new accepted program, and in effect, new baseline we're going to measure future progress and change against. So NEC is very clear on this. Other forms of contract are less clear on the contractual status of a revised program. And then when it comes to compensation events, we've then got clause 62.2 that reminds us that if the program affects the remaining works, then you need to demonstrate the effect against the last accepted program. So potentially a program will need to go with a fair number, shall we say, of the compensation event quotations. And that program should help the quotation be understood why the contractor is claiming the cost that they're actually claiming for. And obviously everything we're running through today, we're focusing on the ECC contract, but we can mirror this with the contractor-subcontractor relationship and indeed any of the contracts within the NEC family. So in terms of programs, regular issue of the revised program and subsequent acceptance is absolutely key to a well-administered contract, because both parties should be having a clear understanding that a program will then give a clear picture of how the remaining works are planned, a real management tool for the contractor to manage their works in terms of resourcing and equipment and plant and materials, but also very importantly, you've then got a mechanism to agree the effects of change, compensation events against. So that's the sort of dual purpose of the program. It's about managing the works forward, yes, a record of what's gone on in the past, and then also a mechanism to assess change. And conversely, if you don't have a program accepted for a long period of time, then the assessment of compensation is going to be much more difficult and subjective, and that's going to then prolong the period where the parties don't understand their respective liabilities. So neither party should be wanting to create that environment. So what can we review in terms of an audit or a health check? So in terms of program, series of questions here that we can then pick up on an audit. How long is it since the last program was accepted? And if it's more than 1 or 2 periods, you've got a problem. And the team should do everything in their power to get back on track with acceptance. In training, I talk about 1 non-acceptance could be considered a blip, 2 is a problem, 3 is a disaster. And if you're more than 3 months, well, okay, there's another adjective we can think about as to what that is. What I normally say is it's a lottery, because at that point, well, you know, how are you going to be assessing change when your program is more than 3 months old? It starts to be very problematic. I was tempted to do a show of hands to say who's got a program more than three periods old, but maybe you wouldn't want to admit that, or it would be a bit too depressing. So just reflect on it if that's the position that you're in. And that is a problem to both parties. So you can't even blame one party or the other. It's both parties' issue if we're not getting a regular accepted program. Don't just blame the other party. It will always be your responsibility to help that process. Does the program show the right, correct level of detail? Obviously, it should comply with clause 31.2, clause 32.1, and don't forget there might be extra over specific requirements in the scope or even Z clauses that the program is required to show. So make sure you satisfy all of those elements. Is a program review meeting held each period? Now, this isn't a compulsory, not like the early warning meeting that Lesley's about to talk to us about, but a program review meeting, if you were to do such a meeting, then you're kind of presenting the program, talking to the other party, explaining what things have changed, explaining what the program is showing, and that will help speed up the understanding and therefore hopefully speed up the response and the stronger likelihood that it can actually be accepted. Another thing that's not a compulsory requirement, but a very good idea, is a program narrative. Why not submit a narrative with the program highlighting what's changed? Is there a change to plan completion? If so, why? Or what key deliverables do we need from the client in the next period? What changes have made in the program and why have we done it? So there's no suspicion here. Are you changing the program to manipulate things in your favor? Why have you done it? So we can head that off with a narrative to accompany the program. And is the project manager's response sufficient if it is not accepted or rejected, as we say in a slang sense? So if they're not accepting the program, then why not? Because the new words in clause 13.4 emphasizes the project manager has not only got to say why they're not accepting the program, but it says now in sufficient detail to allow the contractor to correct the submission. So they shouldn't just be rejecting for a high level reason. They should be explaining really clearly why they are not accepting the program. So that's a few things that we can think about when it comes to program.
Thanks, Glenn. Moving on to early warnings. Glenn and I might disagree, but I think early warnings are actually the heart of a NEC contract. And I'm going to do a quick overview of why look at them within a project audit setting. But one of the main early aims of NEC was to get the parties managing the causes of risk rather than arguing about the consequences of risk. And good use of the early warning process will do exactly that. So this is, and I can see Richard Patterson is on the webinar as well. This is one of the areas where we're required to cooperate and to talk to each other. Essentially, what happens is every time there's a bit of uncertainty, there's a decision point. So it's a place to have a conversation. So the reason to look at early warnings is really to see, are the processes working, which is what NEC sets out to do, but it's also really helpful to have a look at what are the relationships like. And I think the early warning area is a place where you can get key insights into, is this project team working together well? So they're a great place to diagnose how things are going. So moving on to the early warning process, simple yet fundamental process within NEC contracts. So this is about managing risk, not opportunity. So this is, if you're wanting to look at opportunity, you'll be looking at value engineering proposals under 16.1, acceleration, acceptance of defects, whole life cost, or under X21 or X29 climate changes. But early warnings are about the management of risk. And what you'll see on them, 15.1, quite often we think about whether is it time, cost or quality. So what we mean by that is an increase in the total of the prices for cost. Time is completion or a key date. Quality is impair the performance of the works in use. But we've also got other matters which are really important to a client, such as the information model or another partner's objectives, really critical if you're using X12, or whether the climate change requirements. So when you do procurement strategy, people think quite carefully about putting these in. So are we looking at where things are being on these, and then the cost implications. So this is where I think some of the behaviours arise from. The cost implications are there to encourage everybody to submit the early warnings, but if they're not, if you don't, there's actually consequences. So which for the contractor is a potential reduction in time for any compensation event assessment if the PM notifies it at the time of quotations, or disallowed costs within the cost reimbursable options. This is all about the cost that if the early warning could have been adhered to. So when we're doing a health check, let's look at, are we notifying them correctly? Often we see them for time and money, but less so for the other bullets and the other options. We really frequently see them for cost, and then we typically get one of the others if cost is already mentioned. But are we getting, what are early warnings being notified for? And also what could affect, not matters which have affected. So this is not the intention to submit a compensation event notification. It is genuinely the opportunity to manage the risk. Contents, is it easy to understand the risk? What's the matter in terms of one of the bullet points within 15.1 or elsewhere? Which bit of the work is identified and what could happen? The other thing that I think is really helpful on early warnings is really checking the tone. What happens after you get an early warning is you sit at an early warning meeting and you to sit next to each other to look at, are you able to solve this? Is it professional or is it looking to assign blame? It will be easier. And this is the sort of thing that you can check on a health check. Is it professional or is it looking to assign blame? Is it going to make the parties at that early warning meeting work together more effectively? Are they being notified by both parties? So it will tend to be the contractor notifying more because quite often they're closer to the action, but there should be evidence of the project manager notifying as well. Also, has the project manager, so it's interesting who can actually notify early warnings, it's the contractor or the project manager. Has the project manager delegated any early warning notification powers to the supervisor? Quite often, especially if we're looking at those the performance of the works in use, the supervisor will be much closer to the action and able to have a look at that. And then who attends an early warning meeting? These meetings are for solving the matter, not arguing about the commercials. So are the right people attending? How long since the last early warning and how frequently should they be held? So the NEC contract data says how long they should happen, but you can also attend additional ones as required. But are people actually doing that? It was a shift from NEC 3 to NEC 4. Not everybody culturally has made those shifts yet. I also look a little bit at if they're there, is there an escalation on there? So when we're looking at the actions on the early warning register, how long was it since it was last updated? Well, ideally at the end of each early warning meeting. So this is a real place where you can get to the heart of, is this early warning process working? And is there clear separation between the early warning register and the project risk register? So this was one of the other changes between NEC 3 and NEC 4, because people quite often got the different registers conflated. Early warning register is all about the actions. What's the matter and what is somebody going to do about it? The project risk register is quite often what different organisations, and a single project each organisation will probably have their own project risk register, and then there might be a project one and a client one, and on it goes. But what for me is key here is there consistency between those registers? Is everything in the early warning register, or is stuff being held elsewhere, and how is that looking? And I think the final one is really how many early warnings are open and how long for. So one of the requirements is actually to close things down. So once the risk has passed, we move on. And are we looking at all the risks as we go? Because quite often you only look at the beginning ones, the ones that have just been notified in the previous period, but actually that constant mechanism of looking at all the risks, if things are getting closed, it's an indicator that actually everything on the register is being regularly reviewed.
Thank you for that, Lesley. Moving on now then to look at compensation events, but I think just a couple of builds on what Lesley was talking about with early warnings, actually, that I think you were actually absolutely right, Lesley, when you talked about, is the supervisor involved in early warning? Because they're not, as far as the contract's concerned, but there's no reason why they couldn't be. And in particular, issues with quality, when you rightly point out the obligation to give an early warning for something which could impair the performance of the works in use. If we were using that more effectively to early warn about potential quality issues, maybe we would get fewer defects on our projects. Okay, so joining those two things together, I think early warning is the proactive step that we might have a problem. But if we do that effectively, we might avoid us having a defect at all. Okay, so yeah, I just thought it was worth picking up on that point. So on to compensation events then. So firstly, signing the agreement, or as the contract calls it, implementation of compensation events is fundamental to any NEC contract. There always will be compensation events. It's the only certainty I have with any contract. So we shouldn't judge people for having compensation events. What we should judge them on is how quickly they're getting them resolved. And the whole team should be focused on making sure that when they get to the end of the contract, when completion is certified, that we've got as few points of difference at that point as possible. And if we've managed compensation events effectively all the way through, kept pushing them through the process, taken action where we've seen things getting stuck in the process, then hopefully we'll get to the end and there'll be as few points of difference as possible that just have the final few compensation events to sort out, rather than having lots of things still on the table to resolve. So really important point, that. And again, if we do that, hopefully it will avoid us ending up in a dispute situation.
If you're not getting compensation events agreed in a timely manner, or the quotations are not being agreed, then that would suggest and indicate that there are disputes there, because, well, why can't we resolve these things? So that is suggesting that there is a potential issue that we will have there. So what can we review in terms of compensation events? Well, how long does it take for compensation events to progress from notification to implementation? And if you are looking more than 2 or 3 months, then you've definitely got an underlying problem that would then need resolving at that point. Are regular joint compensation event meetings being held? Again, a bit like the programme review meeting, these aren't mandatory, but they're strongly recommended to encourage the continual review and the moving forward of these compensation events forward to implementation. So the prolonged, if we are going to have that meeting, we can review the status of each compensation event and see those that are being notified. Do we agree it is one? And those that we've notified you've not yet responded, what are your thoughts? Do you agree it is one? The quotation, what do you think? Have you received the quote? Or here is our quotation hasn't yet been submitted, but here is our current thoughts as to where it's heading, so that the project manager doesn't fall off the chair when it does arrive. They've already had an idea as to what that quotation was going to be. So that's a really important meeting that we can progressively have. It also then means that we don't need to discuss compensation events in the early warning meeting. And I was going to add to one of Lesley's great points was about not having a commercial presence. Personally, I ban QSs from early warning meetings. And when I say that in training, there's a little bit of a gasp, but then I explain, look, I'm trying to do it for you because you don't need to be there, because this isn't a commercial matter yet. It might not be a problem, but if it is a problem, you can pick up that baton, that mantle at some point in the future. And then if we're having a compensation event meeting, that's when you can discuss the compensation event. So try and separate early warning meetings from compensation event meetings, even if it's with a coffee break in between and then maybe different people attending. We should separate those two elements. Are quotations being submitted on time? Well, if not, the project manager can make their own assessment. I don't know if all contractors realise that if the contractor doesn't submit the quote on time, then the project manager will be making their own assessment. The contracts, we say can, but it actually says that they will. It doesn't. It's not even a choice, actually. The project manager is obliged to make their own assessment of the compensation event quotation. So that's really important if they're not doing that. Is the project manager stating assumptions to limit the amount of risk included in quotations? So this isn't always necessary for assumptions to be stated. Well, it's not actually discretionary when you look at it. So it's not always necessary for there to be assumptions, but where they are necessary, then they should be included. It says the project manager should be doing this where necessary. There's no mechanism for the contractor to state assumptions. So project manager assumptions can be revisited. So where the project manager states an assumption for a quotation, then that can be, the quote can be based on that assumption, and then that element will be assessed as a new compensation event. There's no mechanism for contractor to put their own assumptions within a compensation event quotation. So they can suggest them for the PM to play back in writing, but otherwise, if they don't get that, then they have no choice but to price the risk. So are project managers forthcoming? And you might need to prompt a project manager to be more forthcoming with the assumptions there. Are notification quotations being responded to within the stated agreed times? Very important for both parties to avoid any stalling of the process. So look at how long these are taking during the life of the project to make sure we're trying to stick to the timescales, and how many times are we going through revised quote, revised quote, revised quote. Look at those behaviours and see if you can step in and make sure that those aren't happening. Because once again, a bit like the programme, it should be in neither party's interests to want to drag out the agreement to compensation events, because neither party understands where they are. Are programmes being submitted with quotations? So a majority of the quotes, as we said, would need a programme to go with them, and it would need to comply there with clause 62.2. So have a look and see, is there programmes going with the quotes to help the quotation be understood? And any quotations, how well are they being laid out, and are they sufficiently detailed? It needs to be transparent, detailed, and comply with clause 63 or section 63, and also be in accordance with the schedule or the short schedule of cost components, depending which option you're working under. So agree a template for quotations at the outset. So those are really important, that you do agree from the outset the sort of format, and it's so much easier if you agree that template early on, and then when they're received, they're going to be more receptive. Anything to add on the ones I've just added there?
Just building on your last point about the level of detail that needs to go with the compensation event quotation. I mean, so many times you see compensation events on projects that are submitted on a repeat basis with insufficient supporting information. So the first reason for rejection is often, I need more information to assess this. So we could avoid that if we agree up front the level of detail. If you always need to see an extract from a subcontract account, if you always want to see an invoice to back up any plant and materials that have been purchased, well, just agree that up front, and then it would come in. And from a contractor's point of view or a subcontractor's point of view, you're giving the project manager or the contractor fewer reasons to say no to your quotation. And also, the absolute key thing here, and it's been said many times before, but the three most important things are records, records, and records. If we've got high quality record keeping on our contracts, then compensation events become a lot easier to manage, because we've got records of what happened and why. Things like what almost now seems like an old-fashioned thing, a labour and plant return, or I suppose in NEC speak we should call it a people and equipment return. actual records of what resources on site and what they're doing. Things like resource allocation sheets are key to this as well. So that was the only point I was going to make on top of that, Glenn. Let's move on now to look at payment then, and what we can look at from a health check point of view when it comes to payment. Obviously, it's absolutely key for both parties to make sure that the delta between amounts applied for and amounts certified is as small as possible. Okay, when we get a big delta, then that can damage relationships, it can damage businesses, and fundamentally can lead to disputes as well. So we need to identify what's causing that gap. Is there a misunderstanding? Is it the contractor that's over applying? That the contractor doesn't understand what they're entitled to be paid under the relevant main option that they're under? Or is it a misunderstanding more on the project manager's side of things? Or could it even be, if you're in a cost reimbursable contract, could it be that there's money not being certified because there is a lack of records, as we were just talking about? It's the project manager who is responsible for certifying the correct amount due in accordance with the contract. And what's absolutely key here is that when the project manager is carrying out this function, this certification function, that they are actually acting as an independent certifier, which means they're not on the client side, they're not on the contractor's side. They sit fair and squarely in the middle of the two parties, and their responsibility, their contractual and legal responsibility, is to produce a fair and reasonable assessment in accordance with the contract. Okay, so it isn't to drive down amounts due. Even if the project manager was aware that the client had budgetary issues, the project manager should park that to one side and produce a fair and reasonable assessment as an independent certifier. And always remember the famous quote from Lord Denning from many, many years ago now: cash flow is the lifeblood of the construction industry. So if we are working on client side or contractors working with their supply chain, we shouldn't be deliberately trying to starve the other party of money. We should be wanting to assess amounts due correctly and in accordance with the contract. Firstly, our applications being submitted on time. Now, it is really important that we do this. There was a very subtle change between NEC 3 and NEC 4 when the NEC 3, the application had to be submitted by the assessment date. NEC 4 now it has to be submitted before the assessment date. And if we don't do that, there is a high chance that the contractor will receive either a nil or a negative assessment in that period, because they've got the new clause 50.4 in NEC 4 that requires the project manager to certify the lesser of two amounts. Okay, so making sure we submit the application on time is critical to that. Also, is the project manager clear about how the amount due has been assessed? Again, the project manager has a duty to provide details with the certificate to show how they've assessed the amount due, particularly when assessing less than the contractor's application as well, to make sure those reasons are known and understood. Next thing, our assessment certificates and payments being done correctly and on time. Late or incorrect payments harm cash flow, and in the worst case scenario can cause insolvency. And I've actually lived through this personally with a client of mine who, under certification and late deduction of disallowed costs, fundamentally damaged that business, and it did become insolvent as a result of it. So making sure we're doing it correctly and on time is key. And then our subcontractors being paid correctly and again on time. The smaller contractors are even more sensitive to cash flow, and without them, larger contractors are not able to fulfill their own obligations either. So it's absolutely essential that this is working all the way across the supply chain. And certainly, again, when our contractors are appointed on the cost reimbursable contracts, so options C, D, E, or even F, we should be auditing and checking that payment is working effectively throughout the supply chain.
Thanks, Neil. So general items to review. So these are the bits and bobs that actually they're just good things to keep an eye on. Names of proposed subcontractors and proposed documents being submitted for acceptance. These are the things like maybe contractors' design. They're just good things to keep an eye on. So clause 26 requires it for subcontractors. But we also see, you quite often see a Z clause for people rates. A number of arguments about rates I see, especially for people. Are they being put in? Are they being done for acceptance? So it's really identifying these ad hoc matters that are needed for acceptance. Are the project manager's instructions clear, concise and timely? So clear in writing, as all communications under NEC should be, and by an authorised person. PMIs, and I'm just picking up on the early warnings before, but not everything will be a change in scope after an early warning, which the change in scope then notifies a compensation event. And even if it is a change in scope, if it's not very much, it may not be a compensation event. So all of this can be notified at the same time, and it's just keeping an eye on that. Cloud-based systems being used to manage communication flow. Doesn't matter which one you use. I believe that these should be, if not required by the client in the scope, should be implemented by the contractor at the start of the contract. I think for me, they keep people on track. These cloud-based systems are as good as all the good training courses that you will have, because they are a real-time prompt for everybody to be doing the right thing. Z clauses and secondary options, have they been communicated to the project team? So there's quite often little quirks. Where is your regular contract not a vanilla one? So everybody understands. And also, I think this is really key, the implications for their role in terms of risk profile, timings, procedure, and actually what they need to do. Not everybody on the project needs a level of awareness of NEC at the level of an accredited ECC project manager, but what they do need to know is the contract requires us to do this, so if this happens, I need to do that. They don't need the full detail and everything, but they do need to know what they need to do in their role if something's happening. And has everyone in the project team had NEC training appropriate to their role? So a lot of this and a lot of the training courses that are done, especially at the beginning of the project, they can be really helpful with team building as well. So it's everybody on the same page, how they're actually going to operationalise what's required in the contract, and then making sure it's appropriate to their role. Not everybody needs all the detail, but what we do need is everybody able to do their jobs so that we can deliver great projects.
Some great points there, Lesley. That top one, do you know, I see that a lot. So just the simple matter within section 26 where the contractor's got to issue subcontractor acceptance under 26.2 and then subcontract terms under 26.3. It's amazing how often it just isn't done. But equally, the project manager doesn't pick up on that, and it still seems that they're, you know, I've had people tell me we went the whole project without having that done. No one stopped us. We've been final accounted. So, okay, it's a limited risk, I guess, if you don't do it. But the risk is that if you don't do it, you could be stopped working, and any impact would be your fault as the contractor because you haven't had that done. So, again, it's just about being aware of the rules and making sure you're doing this. It's a really simple one. The project manager will have few reasons for not accepting a proposed subcontractor. Would you agree, Lesley?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the point you made was really key. We've been through a lot of projects and nobody's picked up about it till final account. The reason why these health checks, these actually applying the contract is really important. It improves clarity of everybody's commercial position. And if you know where you are, you know what you can do about it. And I think sometimes that being contractual piece, actually what you're doing is holding everybody to keep the promises that they made when the contract was formed. And we ought to be in an industry where we keep our promises.
Sounds like a good idea to me. The other one to pick up on is that the cloud-based systems being used widely. We did a survey. Some of you might have seen our State of the Industry survey we did through NEC People last year. And what we found was, I think it was 72% of projects are using one of these systems between the client and the contractor, and yet it chopped down to 32% between the contractor and the subcontractor. So it's equally important that we're managing those flow communications between the supply chain, the contractors and the subcontractors. Now, I'm sure Digital Beehive will say it matters which one you choose, Lesley, but I do take your sentiment that I do always say they are similar. All of these cloud-based systems are similar, and it's really important that people do their own homework. I'd never advocate just go to one system. Where you have a choice, check a couple of them. And obviously, Digital Beehive should be one of the ones you check, but compare it to at least 2 other systems, and then you check those systems to see which one is the most contractually compliant, the most user-friendly, and obviously cost-effective will come into it as well. But I do agree with you. The sentiment is that, you know, we want to be using a system. It's much better than the old system, which was paper and registers and things like that. So we should be way beyond that now. So do your homework. Look at these cloud-based systems, check which one does work for you in terms of managing that flow of communications. You might always use the best system you've got available to you. So that is pretty fundamental. Here, I'm just going to do a little demonstration of a project audit I did. Now, here's an early warning. It look a bit primitive because it's a raw audit I did on a project. It won't look impressive, and I'm pretty sure the systems like Digital Beehive will be able to, in the very near future, if not already, give you a health check as part of the system. So that could be a check for your cloud-based system. Can they do an audit for you and just churn out some of this stuff? So this is one I did manually, but as I say, through these clever cloud-based systems, we should be able to hopefully hit a button and it would give us a very similar thing. So I looked at program-wise, what can we check? And we set up a scoring system. So anything more than 12 points was good, 9 to 11 is okay, anything less than 9, okay, you need to look at a bit of an improvement. And it's quite hard to get a good score on the first one, date since last accepted. If it's within the last 5 weeks, you get 5 points. If it's within the last 8 weeks, you get 2 points. Beyond that, you get 0. And you can see on this audit, it was 0. And it will be that harsh, because if you've got a program that's more than 2 months old, you've got a project problem. And you don't want to let it get to that status. So straight away, the best you can get is the low end of okay if you've not had an accepted program within the last 2 months. But I think that's right in terms of the audit. The quality of program, okay, subjective score there, sort of giving it a 2 out of 5. Is there evidence of a joint meeting? So there was some evidence on this one. Level of detail given to the response. So is it a good, well-detailed response from the project manager? If they're not accepting, are they explaining in full why they're not accepting? There, they only got a half. Non-implemented compensation events. A popular misconception is you don't show non-implemented compensations in the program. Well, this will be picked up on another webinar if we haven't already. You do need to show non-implemented CEs, but they can only show the impact against planned completion at that point, but they should be in the program. So you can't wait until implemented CE is implemented before you show it in the program, because it wouldn't be a realistic program in the first place. Neil, anything else you look for on these program audits?
Well, I was just going to say, Glenn, Jane Peaty has asked a question quite a while ago, actually, while you were talking about programs. I thought it was a good one to pick up on now. Jane says, if the PM has not accepted the program and does not say why, what sanctions, if any, does the contractor have on this?
Yeah, with the new sanction is good, isn't it? It's useful in NEC 4 that if they don't respond at all, we know that we can notify the lack of response. If they don't respond within a further week, then the new NEC 4 provision is that it's deemed accepted. But you're right, it doesn't go into massive detail. If the project manager does respond but doesn't comply with clause 13.4, i.e. state in enough detail what's wrong with it to allow the contractor to correct it, then it's limited specifically what the sanctions are, but all you can do is bring that up and point out that, to talk to them and say, you know, you are obliged under 13.4 to explain, have a meeting, talk. Is there anything else, Neil, we can do?
I mean, it technically is a compensation event, isn't it? A breach of contract that's not one of the other compensation events. The contract does require it to be in sufficient detail to enable the contractor to correct the submission. But I'm not sure where that takes you, really, from a compensation event point of view, or even a relationship point of view. I'd be flagging this up to the project manager, trying to chase down, you know, specific reasons why they didn't accept it. And if that wasn't working, I'd be escalating it to the client, because as you've been saying, the longer this guy goes on, the more unlikely it is you're going to get a program accepted, the harder it becomes then to assess compensation events.
Yeah, no, exactly. So yeah, it is talk, and NEC can only go so far. It's not absolutely foolproof. It puts as many measures in place as you can if someone's not doing something, but that is one. Yeah, at least you've got that clause you can refer to. You can remind them under clause 13.4. Come on, you've got to let us know in enough detail what's wrong with it. That's particularly relevant when it comes to design. If you don't accept a design because it doesn't comply with the scope, well, give us a clue. There's so many documents in scope. What do you think it doesn't comply with? Here, I won't go through this one in full, but you can see they're doing all right on early warnings. Rubbish on program, but early warnings, they were doing okay. 11 out of top score on this one. So they're doing okay. 11 out of 15. They're sort of the top end, still marginally room for improvement. But yes, the number of early warnings, we do a sanity check and that they were okay on that. Are historical ones being closed? Yes. Date since the last meeting, well, it was recent, so they got a good score on that one, and so on. So you can score, and then you can obviously look at trends and behaviours over time. And then the last one I think we'll look at here, compensation events. So not doing so well here. So 8.5 out of a top score of 20. So again, a lot of room for improvement here. So this is the kind of thing that we're looking at on our projects. The cloud-based systems will help you to ascertain so you can do these audits within your cloud-based system that you're using. So really simple yet fundamental stuff to check the sort of health and the integrity of your projects. So bit of a summary. So we do have time to hopefully pick up on a few other questions. So regular audits, health checks of your project will support the project team to evaluate how well they're doing and to identify areas for improvement. They should be considered as a positive assurance process to help keep the project on track and not a remedial box ticking exercise. We don't want it to be that. So health check. If you go to the doctors and say, yeah, I don't drink alcohol, I don't smoke. Well, I don't, but well, one of them a little bit maybe. So you've got to be truthful. Otherwise, you know, you're hiding things. And eventually, if you don't tell the doctor you're smoking and drinking, eventually it will probably catch up with you. And we could have done something about that to help you along the way. Every day is a school day. There is always room for improvement. So however well you think you're doing, always look to strive to that extra level for, you know, making things even better. And remember, the hard bit is the improvement. It takes time and resources, but should lead to better outcomes for all parties. So it's difficult. The improvement bit, yeah, not always straightforward, but at least we can see where we're heading and why we're doing it. And it should be achievable that you can always carry on improving. Whatever position you are, don't beat yourselves up as to where we are currently. You can't change what's gone up until that point, but you can impact the future. You can change things going forward. Yeah, hopefully food for thought for you from today's webinar. I'll pass you back to Lauren for some closing thoughts.
Thank you, Glenn. So just going back to our first slide, has anybody got any other suggestions of aspects that we could be audited that haven't been covered in today's session? Feel free to pop those in the Q&A section. We do have a couple of questions that have come through. Richard Patterson has kindly pointed us to an article using KPIs to improve how NEC contracts are used. So feel free to have a browse at that. He's included the link in the Q&A section, so please just take a look at that. And then he's also added a comment. So he's put, I think we should emphasise 64.1. If programme is not accepted for a reason, the PM is required, in capitals, to step in and assess the CEs. That will normally get the contractor to be keener to get the programme acceptable.
I was just going to comment on Richard's, the most important word that he's used is keener to get the programme acceptable. Because if you think about it, that's all we need to do. The programme has to be acceptable. It'll never be perfect, but the contract requires it to be acceptable, which, let's face it, is not a great review of anything, is it? I mean, if I'd been out for a meal last night and I said I went out for a perfectly acceptable meal, nobody here would care where I went. Whereas if I said I went out for a fantastic meal, more people would be interested, wouldn't they? So acceptable, is it good enough to fulfill its functional requirements? So I think that's a key point there, Richard. So well done. Thank you for sharing that.
The very fact that the project manager is required, as Richard says, to make their own assessment of the compensation event. If the latest program's not been accepted for a valid reason under the contract, I doubt they're going to assess it higher than the contractor would want. Let's put it that way. Of course, it'd be fair, but then I say sort of fairly lower. So it's going to be lower than the contractor would want. And at that point, there's not much they can do once it's implemented, apart from challenge that through the dispute process. So really important that, yeah, that's another reason why it is so important. We want to get the program accepted. Lesley, do you want to pick up on the early warning comment Richard made?
Yeah, I do. And also some of the stuff you were saying, Glenn, about the health checks and every day being a school day, and these are really a place to spark a conversation. I think it ties in nicely to Richard's, should we be using early warnings to talk about anything? I think not. I think early warnings, I think we can talk about lots of stuff. The purpose of the early warnings is what actions are we going to do as a result of these matters? And I think if we're using the early warning process to go wider, it actually dilutes it. But that's not to say we can't just have a chat, because we can have lots of chats. We don't need to contractualize every conversation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Lesley. I don't think we should be diluting the early warning process with other things, but I think we should be talking regularly about opportunities where they exist, that is, because obviously it depends on both the contract and procurement strategy as to where those opportunities exist, whether they exist at all. So yeah, definitely space, but possibly not in the context of a regular early warning meeting for me.
No, I'd agree. Just looking at the time, in terms of other aspects that we haven't covered, well, please add to the Q&A if anyone thinks of any other topics. The one we know we didn't include today, just because of time, was quality. And maybe contractors, you'd say, well, we do things right first time, so there's no need to audit that. But quality would be an aspect of certain things. We can you could do an audit on how many sort of defects are being unearthed, and are they being corrected in the sort of timescale. Things like that. So that's definitely one other topic that we didn't specifically talk about today, really just because of time. But yeah, other than that, I think we covered most elements. So if there is anything else that people think should be covered in an audit, do let us know in terms of what that could or should be.
Thanks, Glenn. And we've just had a comment from Sam McLean. So could a session be held on auditing defined cost on reimbursable forms of contracts?
Well, your wish is our command, Sam. So it sounds like that will be a topic of a future webinar. So yeah, and oh, look at the thumb. There's clapping emojis and everything calling that. So yeah, that sounds like a definite topic, Sam. There's a few things we could pick up on there. So we can talk about scheduler cost components, disallowed costs, all that kind of element. So yeah, I think you've given us our next webinar. We've already got one scheduled for March, but maybe that could be April's, Lauren. So we'll leave that on your agenda.
Yeah, want to pass to the marketing team to scope out. So thank you for that, Sam. Lesley, I think we're nearly out of time. So just to recap on a couple of things, we will be sharing the recording from today's session with all of the attendees. We'll also make sure that you do have the contact details for all our guest speakers, Neil, Glenn and Lesley. So if you've got any follow-up questions or if you need any advice or support, they can certainly assist you. And again, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everyone that's attended the webinar today, and a special thanks to our guest speakers, Glenn, Neil and Lesley, for taking time out of their day to deliver this session today. Thank you once again, and we'll see you for our next one in March.